That's the end of the marketing section of this talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Adam Nathaniel Furman, the designer and artist who's hightailed it here from London to be with us, whose work I've been following for a long time now. It's rare you meet a designer these days who has such a specific and distinct expression and is concerned with ideas and questions that are really fundamental. So the idea of community, of identity, of self-worth, and so on. So I'm really happy you're here, Adam. And just by way of introduction, if you haven't heard of Adam before, I think I'm right in saying you trained in architecture. Is that right? Adam works across diverse scales and disciplines, from painting, videos, and prints to large public artworks, furniture, interiors, and beyond. Everything's unified, I would say, by your vibrant aesthetic, which combines diverse influences into a distinctive visual language that is singular and very much your own. You've been exhibited and are also collected internationally. And your work, it seems to me, delights in community, inclusivity, and the transforming power of spaces that provide joy and inspiration, and also, very importantly, give you the license to just be yourself. So, Adam, first of all, seeing that you are such a kind of factotum, let's kind of move product design and your kind of smaller scale artwork to one side and just think about your spatial design work. How do you approach it in terms of mindset? Are you do you activate the architect within you at the start of that process, or is it a large scale artwork, or does it even matter? Do you rationalize your processes?
I mean, my processes in terms of the design methodology is, I think, relatively traditional because I trained in architecture, I worked in architecture, I taught in architecture, I publish about architecture, and I criticize architecture. So I guess I'm sort of steeped in spatial thinking and strategies. And so I guess rather than, a move from object design to spatial design, for me it was a matter of getting used to designing objects. So I think spatially, and the strategy that I do come up with, I tend to think of them as things which apply within an urban context. And then if I'm working at a domestic scale, I'm sort of scaling down the same way of thinking at an urban scale.
So for you, there's a process that is, as you come from an architectural kind of perspective. You've delivered a lot of projects that seem to have community at the heart of them, either community-driven or concepts that are developed to possibly create a community or reinforce a sense of community. What is community to you? What does community mean? What does a successful community look like?
I mean, it's a very big word that means a lot of different things to different people. But in my practice specifically, it is important. I think it's important to many designers now. But for me specifically, coming from, as a Londoner, I come from a queer context, which is important to me. It was important for me growing up to experience how affirmative or affirmational it can be to be part of a community who are proudly embodying themselves through events and spaces, whether they're commercial, non-commercial, communal, in the city. And so that meant that when I went into my architecture career, I've always been really interested in the question of the representation of identity through aesthetics and material culture. And so it's not necessarily about promoting one community, but rather about coming up with strategies for how aesthetics, colour, form can embody a community's existence in a very simple and aesthetic way in space, through objects or through spaces. And so I've done that now in London. Luckily, I've just been very lucky over the past sort of 10 years to work with numerous different communities. and be able to work with them normally over there's a kind of luxury of time involved in these projects because they tend not to be purely commercial. So I have, jobs which are they're more about bringing the fees in, and then there are ones which are more about working, I guess not entirely pro bono, but working over a longer period of time with less margins. But it's about teasing out with different groups within the community through lots of consultation and consultation meetings, lots of design workshops, what sorts of aesthetics they really strongly relate to, and when they see it in a space, they feel that's me, and that's a really enjoyable process that I love doing.
In that sense, you're a translator.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yes, but through the prism of, so obviously I bring my own aesthetics to a degree to every project, and it's a matter of, I guess, adjusting the kaleidoscope of me to their tastes, as it were. So yes, translator, but through a particular filter.
I mean, we talk about the perils of creative decision by committee. Tell me about the challenges of working like that type of process where there is an element of kind of co-creation, or is it simply that the community involved at the start to build the brief, and after that you are in total creative control of what happens?
I think it depends. So it really does depend on how the project is commissioned a lot of the time. So
just on that, sorry to interrupt you. Are we talking about for public spaces? Are we talking about local councils, not-for-profit clients, or are they sometimes commercial?
So precisely. I mean, that's the thing. So it's all of those, but it is very different, the approach, depending on which one of those you're working for. So, for instance, if I'm working for a council, there's going to be particular community groups in an area that they already have a relationship with, and one tends to work with those, but there's a lot of suspicion. Very often people feel that the council works against them. Whereas if I'm working for a charity organisation, a third sector organisation, or a community group who are doing the commissioning, it already means that from the very beginning there's a kind of raison d'etre for the project which comes from them. And it means that from the very beginning the brief is already geared towards the community, and it's less about sort of, I guess, calming people who are very suspicious and angry, and more about helping a process which has already begun. Almost you're like joining for the ride. It's much, much more complicated if you're coming on board for a body who is commissioning it, who people feel doesn't represent them, and in some ways has worked against them in the past. Weirdly, the working for commercial clients actually is sometimes easier than working for local councils, because they're normally complete outsiders, and very often you kind of have a clean slate to begin with. Whereas with the council, there's often some lingering resentment from previous projects. But I just find it does help a lot if it's community driven in the first place.
And am I right in thinking that there's just more politics involved if the client is a council, for example, if it involves elected members who are involved in the decision?
Yeah, I mean, understandably, right? You get different groups, different factions. Sometimes also there's quite a lot of staff turnover within those organisations. But also I found, I had really fantastic experiences with both NHS trusts, which are, so for those
Does everyone know the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, which is
it's known in the UK for being a sort of very unwieldy and large organisation, and also the trusts which run individual hospitals being very, very large and difficult to deal with. But my experience has actually been very different and very positive. And similarly, I've had really fantastic examples of councils that other people would say, oh, no, they're so large and difficult to deal with, because of kind of thought leaders within those organizations. And I do find that, and this is the same also within community groups, it's dynamic individuals who take projects under their wing and spearhead them, and they will fight through all of the bureaucratic inertia and barriers that will stop the project from happening in order to make it happen, and make it happen in the best way. And those people exist also in organizations like councils, national health trusts, and in community groups as well. So I do find I can tell that when there's like a really charismatic, dynamic figure or two or three who are driving it and they make it their own, everything actually just becomes a lot smoother. Because I have when those figures have not existed, I have had quite a few projects basically just unintentionally die on the bed of inertia.
Speaking of unintentional death,
Sorry.
let's think about. I mean, so you deliver a project. How do you measure the success of a project? Say this one, but behind us. I mean, how do we know that it's? How do we know that the community has adopted it? That it's working for you? What would the success criteria be?
I mean, I guess I'm still learning. Well, I guess I can tell when it's not a success. Sort of,
Can you give an example of
so
less than successful outcome?
I guess I've been lucky to avoid the really severe examples, but I think when local people decide that it is a symbol of objectification or external intrusion into their space, vandalism becomes very quickly an issue. So I've been very lucky not to have that happen, but I can completely understand and see how it could have happened on some of the projects that I've worked on. But I think seeing success, it comes in many different forms. One, to come back to the National Health Service, National Health Trust that I work for, the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, which I'm not sure if I have photos of it up, but I completely redid all of the entrance areas, reception areas, the ward divisions of the country's second biggest maternity sector there. And what was really great was that they have a team within the trust there who study the benefits in terms of wellness for nurses, doctors, and patients from all of the interventions that they make in a quantitative manner. So, I mean, I tend to get a lot of anecdotal evidence of people, for instance, the hospital one, there's, so many people who send me photographs of them with their babies and they're in front of, the ceramics and they say, it's so wonderful that when I was waiting, nervous, but I had this
anecdotal, it's qualitative.
Just qualitative anecdotal. But then the National Health Trust, actually from the 50s, aesthetics have been something that they've studied.
So how is this quantified though?
I don't really understand. So I get the end results where they say this is fantastic and it's 50% improvement in people's mood or whatever. I don't quite understand the methodology because I am anything but scientific. I'm definitely not scientific, but it's nice to know that people are doing those numbers. But on the other projects that I've worked on, all of the kind of evidence, positive evidence, is anecdotal. But it's lovely to receive anecdotal evidence. And I very often go and I'll sit around my pieces. If they're temporary, I'll sit around them for most of the time that they're up. And if they're permanent, I'll go visit them on days when I'm free and just see how people interact with them and talk to people.
Just a couple of bread and butter questions now. Are there particular set of materials that you favour in these types of projects? And also, can you say something about the significance and the effects of your deployment of colour in your work?
So material is sort of everything. It's really, really important to me. And actually, I think it's something that I'm becoming quite tough on in terms of what I agree to do now. Because in the past, I think if you think about it in terms of the city being a place where minorities and minority communities are not normally allowed to embody themselves except for temporary events like Carnival or Pride, that's where you're allowed to sort of show your identity as a minority group. And similarly, as a designer, a lot of the works that I was being invited to do were pop-ups, so they were temporary urban interventions, and just by necessity, when something is temporary and there's a specific budget for a temporary work, you can't use materials that have any sort of substantive quality because they either need to be thrown away or ideally recycled. So it's kind of very specific set of materials you can use. And if you're working with color and ornament, it tends to be particular types of material that's printed, that's quite plasticky, that's very bold and bright, quite garish. And I've sort of been turning down those types of jobs because what I really want is to insert into the public realm permanent works which are embedded in the physical fabric of our architecture, of our public squares, which is of high quality, which which is made of ceramics, which is made of metal.
For example, the Croydon Colonnade.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I still can't believe that project actually happened, but I don't.
Yeah, I'll point it out when it comes up. It's absolutely beautiful, stunning.
So that's a kind of prime example of the kind of thing that I'm now pushing to be able to do. Those are all handmade, 16,000 handmade large porcelain tiles, and every single one is different. They have an incredibly, if I may say so myself, but it's to do with the makers who are so fantastic, but they have an incredibly beautiful and sophisticated quality where the glaze is very thick and they change in light. They change depending how you move around them. People walk past, they touch, everyone touches them. And it's that sense of love and care and concern for the public realm where people feel that they're thought about, they're in a place. And it's a place which is not made through pop-ups or projections or an event which disappears after 2 hours. It's a place which is created through money being spent on it in a beautiful way. And so I'm really pushing for crafted materials. I'm doing the largest mosaic in London in like 100 years at the moment in London Bridge, and that's handmade mosaics with a community group, again, which are very tactile. To kind of go back to that Victorian or sort of pre-Second World War idea of art for everybody. So materials super important.
And materials that one recognises and reads as having an honesty about them and are tactile.
I mean, I'm fundamentally a Ruskinian.
I was just about to say exactly the same thing myself. And on colours. I mean, what's the this is the Croydon. Is this Croydon? Yes.
Yes.
Part of Croydon.
Yeah.
A detail.
Each of those tiles are about that large.
What is the? Do you worry much about what the architecture community thinks of your work? What has their response been to these types of projects, and in particular to your use of colour?
I mean, the architecture. I think there's a difference between the architecture community that are very vocal, and then the wider architectural community. And I think the architectural community that are quite vocal. I've been working for a long time now, so sort of since about 2008, and I think for the first decade or so, they were quite antagonistic. I think maybe.
Why? Why do you think that?
I think there was a sort of communal trauma in the architecture community because of postmodernism. I think a lot of these people were brought up under the orthodoxy of late postmodernism, and I think when you're brought up under any orthodoxy, you learn to hate it. Understandably, because it's become an orthodoxy. And I think they saw colour and they just thought automatically that's just a revival of postmodernism, which is not. I mean, I'm very interested in it, but it's not a revival per se. And so I think that was why the reaction possibly, but I think the majority of the profession were just like, oh, that's interesting. And what's happened since 2019 is there's been a kind of, the oil tanker has been slowly turning in the United Kingdom, where, I mean, we have a very vibrant architectural culture there, which I'm very proud of, and there's always been very interesting projects happening, but the work has been shifting towards being once again interested in the kind of things that I am: identity, ornamentation, craft, historical kind of illusion, art incorporated with cultural ideas into architecture. And so the reception it's been a bit like whiplash. So suddenly, from being used to sort of, I guess, certain kind of reactions, suddenly being sort of celebrated to a degree has been quite shocking. It's like, oh, okay, thank you, but don't quite know how to deal with that.
I mean, how does that affect you on a personal level? I mean, your work is fair to say that you have a lot of skin in the game. I mean, your own personal story, and if you don't mind me saying so, kind of your biography informs the way you work and what you want to achieve. I mean, this recognition, how does that make you feel?
I guess I'm just slightly weirded out by it. It hasn't turned into necessarily anything concrete in terms of my professional life changing. And I think if it does turn into types of, or sort of a new stream of workflow that coming in, then I'll be really happy. For now, I'm just a bit bemused.
But what about the paradox between, because I at some point I've either read it or you said in the past you labelled yourself or you positioned yourself as non-conformist, or maybe the space you were creating, the environments you were creating were for people who feel like they don't conform.
Yeah.
What happens when you, as a creator, become very popular and in demand and receive commission after commission?
I don't know. I'll tell you when that happens. I mean, it hasn't happened yet.
That sounds like an invitation for offers. Frankly.
I mean, this is a question that's come up, that came up in a really interesting way when I was with Joseph Steele Henry, previously of the GLA, an amazing, important figure, non-conformist figure who's also been sort of changing the London scene. We were both giving a talk together up in Preston at UCLan, and we were both asked a really interesting question because we were very combative in our presentations. We're very similar in the sense that we feel like outsiders and we're fighting a fight. And the question was very relevant. It was, now both of you are becoming really recognized and sort of seen as kind of establishment.
And co-opted, possibly.
And what happens when you realize you're fighting a fight that's no longer relevant and that you've already won, and you realize actually you're the kind of person that you used to fight against? And I think both of us were a bit flummoxed. We didn't really know what to say. And I don't think we're there yet, but it's definitely something to be aware of. And I think my work will definitely, because I would like to be aware of that shift happening. If it does happen, I hope it happens. God, please make it happen. But I think I would like to think that my work will evolve with it, so that I won't be constantly producing work that is sort of really pushing back in a very extreme way against something which no longer is there to push back against. I hope it becomes a bit more relevant for its position.
I think it's quite hard, but very necessary to always try and retain this kind of third-person, kind of self-critical distance. It's very easy to, I think, if a project is successful and you get more work on the back of it, to still retain that.
Yeah, and I mean
that position.
Luckily, I've got an Italian boyfriend who I think his favourite thing is being insanely critical. So it's very helpful. I've always got a dose of reality at home.
It's a question about there's so much joy. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why your work is seems to be responding to or touching the kind of a moment, the zeitgeist, call it what you will, in the UK at the moment. Is that things have been quite tough over the last few years, post-Brexit, post-COVID, and so on. We won't go into politics, we won't go into the kind of economy and so on. But there is this need to find joy where you can, also in the city as well, because your spaces provide such a strong kind of counterpoint usually to the kind of the fabric around them. But I had this question about joy. How do we? One man's joy might be or one person's joy might be another person's like, oh, that is really not my idea of.
Yeah.
Is that a fair comment?
No, it absolutely is. I mean, obviously, taste is entirely. That's the simplification. It's entirely subjective. I would say that taste is culturally produced, but that means that we're all part of unique subcultures, and we can respond very differently to things. One thing can make one group very joyful and happy, and another one will find it. As one lady put it recently, she wants to just scratch her eyes out, looking at all of the bold colours. So it does change, but I think the point that I try and I think Ruskin is important for me. Well, not only Ruskin, that entire sort of milieu, progressive Victorian thinkers about design and aesthetics are important to me, because I don't like to think about my work as being isolated and special within this otherwise very grey urban environment. My great joy is imagining the city as a kind of parliament of different tastes, where public spaces, architectures, interiors which are visible from the outside are all registers of different identities, where people have the freedom to express themselves. And actually, if you look back at the kind of pre-1940s urban landscapes of the United Kingdom, I mean, this is probably the same in many other places, I'm very, very British. It was an absolute cacophony. in which you had small landowners building architectures which absolutely were based upon their own particular beliefs. You had Methodists who were doing architecture which was very, very different from Catholics, which were doing architecture which was very, very different from high Anglicans, which is very different from low Anglicans. Let alone all of the different other cultural, let alone all of the other cultural differences. And this is something that I like to imagine my work as being part of, that I don't need to represent everyone, but actually everyone starts to represent themselves more. And I think there's a kind of level of diversity which is starting to come into the British architecture scene, which is starting to, in a small way, do that again, which I find really exciting. So I guess my answer would be that some of my work gets focused on simply because the lack of other work which is different.
Because
of the extreme uniformity of the past 30 years of construction.
Or even longer, I'd say. When modernism and, has a lot to answer for.
I would qualify with that with the fact that actually up until the 1980s, there was a great tradition of incorporating decorative art and craft and sculptural art into modernist architecture, as well as textiles, interior, I guess quite sophisticated interior design, which sort of from the boom of speculative office development started to disappear. So yes, a lot of the architecture itself became more monotonous, but actually there was still a lot going on the architecture, within the architecture. We kind of lost a lot of that since the 80s.
I love that, the idea of a parliament of
symbolic parliament
of different voices. That's my quote for today. Adam, thanks so much for being there. Your work is wonderful, and it has real meaning to it. It's not often that we can kind of say that. And thanks to you for being a great audience.